Can I first and foremost commend Sir Iain Livingstone, the Chief Constable of Police Scotland, for acknowledging institutional racism and indeed misogyny and other discriminatory behaviours within Police Scotland. That is the first step that is required in order to then dismantle those institutional and structural barriers that exist. Douglas Ross was right to put the emphasis on the fact that, of course, this is not an inference on individual police officers who we know put themselves in harm's way to protect us day in and day out. But there is no doubt that institutional racism exists in our society. And I want to take a moment just to say that, as a person of colour, the statement from the Chief Constable is monumental, historic. I remember raising issues around racism in the police force, Strathclyde Police as it was back then, when I was stopped and searched over a dozen times as a young boy, whether it was in my car or walking with my friends in the street or in airports at the time. And so the acknowledgement from the Chief Constable is very welcome indeed. I hope it also serves as a reminder to all of us that in whatever organisation we belong to, we have a responsibility to also question whether or not the organisations that we lead, certainly this is the case for me in the organisation that I lead, that we examine and reflect on whether we are doing enough to dismantle those barriers, not just of institutional racism, but structural discrimination that exists for many people with a disability or because of their sexual orientation, because they are women, so on and so forth. So I do welcome the statement from the Chief Constable. As the Chief Constable himself has said, having now made that acknowledgement, it's so important we now see action in terms of what can be done to dismantle those barriers. And again, I just end my answer to that particular question by saying that I take my responsibility seriously as First Minister, and I rededicate myself to do everything I can to dismantle those barriers of institutional racism, misogyny, bigotry and discrimination where they exist here in the Scottish Government, and what I can do right across society in that regard.
Douglas Ross.
The Chief Constable also said this today: when an organisation doesn't have all the necessary policies, processes, practices and systems in place to ensure it doesn't happen, it is an institutional matter. The SPA report also found, and I quote, significant concerns about the absence of effective performance management systems during the first decade of Police Scotland's existence. So the problem here is wider. It is systemic. It starts far away from the front line with the management and the leadership. Does the First Minister agree? And given that he has just rededicated himself to tackling this issue, what urgent action will his government take in response to the SPA report and the Chief Constable's statement today?
First Minister.
Of course, those in management and leadership positions absolutely have to bear responsibility, particularly where it is organisations that we lead. It is our responsibility to ensure that we examine the evidence, we collate the data, and we come to the conclusion around those structural barriers that exist. That is true for me as First Minister. I'm certain Douglas Ross will be reflecting on the organisation, the political party that he leads as well. So there is an important point for those that are in management or indeed leadership. There is one phrase that is often used by Anna Sawar for all our disagreements. There's one phrase that I've always found that he has used that I think captures the issue very well, and that is that this is a fight for us all. I think that's absolutely right. I think although management and leadership absolutely have a role to play, all of us have a role to play in our organisations in order to confront those barriers, reflect on what more we can do to undermine them. I'm committed to working with Police Scotland, but above and beyond that, I want to make sure that all of those organisations that are particularly within the public sector, I want to make sure that we are collecting the data, that we have a view on those structural barriers that exist, and then, of course, work with senior management and leadership right across, particularly the public sector, but I'd also challenge the private sector in this regard too, as I say, to dismantle those barriers that we know have existed and do exist right across our society.